of what the film has to offer. It's really quite remarkable. Anyways, Jung split with Freud on the issue of the Oedipal story as the fundamental myth of humankind, and on the issue of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And Jung came down heavily on the side of the validity of the religious viewpoint. And he established that in a book called Symbols of Transformation, which was written in 1914. And that's the book that produced the permanent split with Freud. And that book, I would say that book's actually been written 3 times. It was written as 4 times, written as Symbols of Transformation, which Jung extensively revised when he was old. And then it was rewritten, in a sense, by a student of Jung's called Erich Neumann, who's also someone I would really recommend. Erich Neumann, I think, is Jung's greatest student. And he wrote 2 books. He wrote one called The Origins and History of Consciousness, which is a description of the development of consciousness out of unconsciousness, using the hero myth as an interpretive skeleton. So Neumann viewed the hero myth as the dramatized story of the emergence of human consciousness out of the surrounding unconsciousness in which it was embedded. The struggle of consciousness upward towards the light, like a lotus flower struggles up through the muck and the water to lay itself on the surface of the water and bloom and reveal the Buddha, which is, of course, what the lotus flower does from a symbolic perspective. And for Neumann, the hero's story was the story of the successful development of consciousness. And The Origins of Consciousness, The Origins and History of Consciousness is a great book. Interestingly, Camille Paglia read The Origins and History of Consciousness. She's one of the few mainstream intellectuals that I've ever encountered who read that and commented on it. And she believed that it would be sufficient antidote to postmodern denigration of literature. She thought it was that powerful a work, and I believe that. I think it's a remarkable book. Carl Jung wrote the foreword to that book, and he said in the foreword that it was the book that he wished he would have written. So it's sort of like Jung, who wrote, I don't remember how many volumes, dozens of very thick, difficult volumes. It was like Neumann was able to distill those into a single volume statement. And so I would also say, if you're interested in Jung, the best book to read is The Origins and History of Consciousness. It's the best intro into the Jungian world. So Jung's very difficult to understand. It requires a real shift of perspective in order to understand what he's talking about. And Neumann wrote another book called The Great Mother, which is a little bit more specialized in some sense, but it's also extremely interesting because it fleshes out the archetype of chaos and its representation as feminine. It's a brilliant book as well, and highly worth reading, both those books. Anyways, Jung was a very strange person and a visionary, and so that's kept him outside of the academic realm almost entirely. I mean, I was constantly warned as an undergraduate and then a graduate student and then a professor against ever talking about Jung in any way whatsoever. When I went on the job market, when I was at McGill, when I had graduated from McGill, I had done my scientific research on alcoholism, and I had a fairly lengthy publication record that was pure empirical research and really neurophysiological research into the pharmacology of alcoholism. And I had established a reasonably solid dossier of publications, but at the same time I was writing this book that became Maps of Meaning, and so I'd split my time in graduate student school between these two endeavors, one very specifically neurological and pharmacological and really biologically based, and the other very abstract, religious, symbolic, psychoanalytic, the complete opposite. But I could see that the two things overlapped really nicely, and there was a number of scientists at the time that were also drawing the same conclusions, the same relationship between the biology and the psychoanalysis. Jaak Panksepp, who wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which is a great classic, is one of those people who saw the relationship between the neurobiology of emotion and motivation and the psychoanalytic insights. never became a mainstream view, but I think it's too complex. I think that bridging the gap between the biology and the symbolic is too much for people, generally speaking. You know, it was certainly virtually too much for me because I got quite ill when I was a graduate student, I think, for a variety of reasons. I also would go out and party 3 nights a week, and so that probably had something to do with it. But working on those two things simultaneously was also rather exhausting. Now, Jung was a tremendously insightful clinician, and he was a strange person, introverted visionary, high in introversion, very, 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 very high in openness, like off the charts. And also, God only knows what his IQ was. I mean, every time I read Jung, it's like reading Nietzsche. It's terrifying because, you know, he's so damn smart that he can think up answers to questions that you don't even, it's not like you don't understand the answers. It's that you never conceptualized the damn questions. It's really something to read someone like that, right, who says, well, here's a mystery, and you think, wow, I never thought of that as a mystery, and here's the solution. It's like, okay, that's something, you know. And he could read Greek, and he read a very large variety of ancient languages and was very familiar with the entire corpus of astrological thought and of alchemical thought and of classic literature and biblical stories, and I mean, educated in a way that no one is educated now. And so he's a very daunting person to encounter, and terrifying, absolutely terrifying. His book, Ion, which is the second volume of volume 9, which is the Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious. That damn book is just absolutely terrifying because Jung, he's one of these visionaries who can see way underneath the social structures and look at patterns that are developing across, in Jung's case, across thousands of years, and lays them out. And so that's really something to encounter. Ion is a terrifying book. Anyways, one question might be, well, because I read Jung and I think, how the hell did he know these things? How could he figure these things out? I can't understand how he could possibly know these things. Well, here's a partial answer. Jung was a visionary, and so what that means, as far as I can tell, and we could do a little quick survey here. How many of you think in words? Put up your hands. Do you think in words? Okay, so it looks like. What about pictures? How many of you think in pictures? Okay, so that's interesting. How many of you think, that's about half and half, by the way, probably a fewer on the word side. How many of you think in pictures and words? Okay, and so, all right, so it was roughly a third in each category, but that's also something that I really haven't encountered any research on from the neuropsychological perspective. It's like, well, do you think in pictures or do you think in words? And is that actually a reliable distinction? I think in words most of the time. But I can think in pictures. Like if I'm trying to build something, I can think in pictures almost instantaneously, but it isn't my natural mode of thinking. I'm hyperverbal, and so my natural mode of thinking is to think everything through in words. But I know my wife isn't like that. She thinks in images and then has to translate them into words. And so, anyways, Jung was very literate, and he could really think in words, but he could really think in images. Also, talking to my wife quite extensively, like the intensity of her visualization vastly exceeds mine. So for example, if I close my eyes and I try to imagine the crowd in front of me, it's pretty low resolution and vague and not brilliantly colored and vivid. You know, it's like I'm seeing through a glass darkly, let's say. I can't bring images to mind with spectacular clarity, but my wife is very good at that, and Jung seemed to be absolutely a genius at that kind of thinking. And he had a lot of visionaries in his family history as well. So I don't know to what degree there's a hereditary component of that, and I don't know to what degree that's actually like a neurological specialization. I presume it would be associated with the trait openness distinguishes itself, differentiates itself into interest in ideas and interest in aesthetics. And my suspicion is that the people who are more interested in aesthetics are the visionary types, the ones that think in images. Anyways, Jung could really think in images, and he could imagine beings. And I had a client once who was a lucid dreamer. And how many of you have had a lucid dream? So you know you're dreaming while you're, okay, many. That phenomena wasn't really even identified as a phenomena until the end of the 19th century. There was a book written about it that Freud tried to get his hands on but couldn't, because it was a very rare book. And then there was a researcher about 30 years ago who started to study lucid dreams. But anyways, I had a client who was a lucid dreamer, and one of the things she could do was ask her dream characters what information they were trying to convey, and they would tell her. So that was very interesting. And one of the consequences of that was, and I don't have this story completely right in my memory, but it's close enough. She was afraid of a very large number of things. And in her dream, I think it was a gypsy standing by a wagon, told her that if she was going to be successful in university, that she would have to visit a slaughterhouse. And that was something that was way beyond her capacity to tolerate. She was a vegetarian. She couldn't stand the sight of raw meat even. And she was very oppressed and depressed and anxious because of the slaughterhouse nature of existence. And so her dream focused on that. And one of the consequences of that, because the slaughterhouse was out of the question as a clinical intervention, I took her to an embalming. Right, because I asked her what might be equivalent to that. And so she suggested that. And, you know, exposure therapy is a hallmark of clinical psychology, right? One of the things you do with people as a clinician is you find out what they're afraid of, and you gradually and voluntarily expose them to that, and that cures them. And that's associated with the hero myth, right? It's exactly the same thing. It's like there's a dragon, it's stopping you, because there's lots of dragons. Most of them aren't stopping you. You can ignore them. You don't have to just go, you know, slash away at randomly. You're not supposed to be fighting dragons that aren't in your way. But if they are in your way, you can't ignore them. And then you decompose them into sub-dragons, and you have people, you know, take them on. And as they take them on, they dispense with the dragon, and they gain the power of the dragon. It's like a video game. Actually, a video game is like that. That's why people like the video games. Well, that's right? There's a reason that you absorb power when you overcome things when you play a video game. It's not like that's intrinsic to the video game structure. That's an archetypal idea. Anyways, we went and saw an embalming, which was a very interesting experience and quite useful for her, because she knew what she could tolerate after that. And it was a hell of a lot more than she thought she could tolerate. And so that's very useful to know. Back to Jung. He's a visionary thinker. Now, my client, I said, she could lucid dream, and she could ask her dream characters what they wanted and what they were trying to communicate to her. So that was pretty interesting. That happened spontaneously, had nothing to do with me. I mean, I'm interested in dreams, and many of my clients are great dreamers, especially the creative ones, because I think it's a hallmark of creativity to have vivid dreams and to be able to remember them. But that was a faculty that was natural to her. Jung had this other client at one point, and she had a variety of fears, and she had this dream that she told me, and she was walking down a beach, and on the side of the beach, up a dune, a small dune, there was this old man with a snake, a big python, and there's a crowd around him, and she was walking by the snake handler and the snake and the crowd, and she didn't want to have anything to do with him. He was sort of showing people this snake, and she told me that dream, and I thought, well, you know, you probably need to go see that snake. And so I relaxed her. It's a quasi-hypnotic technique, and it's very straightforward. Hypnosis is generally nothing but pronounced relaxation, although you have to be susceptible to hypnosis to actually fall into a hypnotic trance as a consequence of being relaxed. I just relaxed her. I had her breathe deeply and pay attention to different parts of her body and just relax her muscles one by one, essentially, so that she could concentrate. And then I told her we'd play with the dream a little bit. It's a Jungian technique. I said, well, so call the dream image to mind, which she could do quite well. I said, okay, so let's explore it. It's like pretend play. You know, if you're a kid and you're pretend playing, you don't exactly direct the game, right? You play the game. So it's partly your direction, obviously, because you're the player, but the thing also happens spontaneously of its own accord. And you could think about that as a dialogue between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, in some sense. It's a developmental dialogue. It's not a fun game if you just direct it. It's only a fun game if you're inviting and something is welling up as a consequence. It's the same thing that happens when you're you're engaged in some kind of artistic or literary production. If it's all top down, if you're forcing it, then it's propaganda, it's empty. What you want to sort of is put yourself in a receptive state of mind, in an imaginative state of mind, and it's sort of half you and half nature itself manifesting itself in your creative imagination. And that was the sort of state that we were striving for. And I asked her when she was relaxed, I said, well, what do you think about the snake handler? And she said, well, he's probably a charlatan and he's just there trying to impress the crowd and to show off. And she was afraid to go up there because she thought people would push her towards the snake and she'd have to touch it. And so there was a fear of the crowd issue going on there too. And I said, well, just look, go up there, but do it under these conditions. Is that, if people get pushy, what are you going to tell them? And so we figured out something. He said, look, you just tell them that, you want to look at the snake at your own pace and that you don't need any encouragement or help, and it would be good if you were just left alone. So that enabled her to defend herself. So she was afraid that the crowd would push her to do something that she didn't want to do. That was part of the theme of the dream. So anyway, she eventually climbed the dune in her imagination and went into the crowd, and the crowd turned out to be quite welcoming and not hostile and not pushy, which isn't what you'd expect, right? Because you'd think the crowd would have reacted in accordance with her fears, since it was her fantasy. But that's the thing about fantasies, they have this autonomous quality. But the crowd was welcoming and not hostile, and it turned out that the snake handler wasn't a charlatan. He was just an old guy who had this snake, and he was out there just showing it to people because he thought it was a cool thing, and that maybe it was good for people to come and look at a snake. And so she got close enough to the snake to touch it. And so I'm telling you that because I want you to understand a bit more about what Jung was trying to do. And so he wrote these books, notebooks that haven't been published yet, called the Black Books. And the Black Books are the documentation of his experiments with his imagination. And what he would do is daydream, like a child daydreams. He regained that faculty, although I think with Jung it was a faculty that had never really disappeared. And he had figures of imagination that came to him that he could speak with. And he spoke with these figures of imagination and documented that over a very long period of time. And that was eventually distilled into a book called The Red Book, which was published about 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a book that Jung regarded as the central source from which all his inspiration emerged. It was sort of, the way it looks to me is that we embody a lot of information in our action, right? And our action has developed as a consequence of imitating other people. And not only the people around us, but of course the people around us imitated the people who came before them, and those people imitated the people who came before them, and so on, so far back that it's as far back as you can go. And so you embody these patterns of behavior that are extremely informative, that you don't understand, that are a consequence of collective imitation across the centuries. And so then those patterns can become manifest as figures of the imagination. And those figures of imagination are the distillations of patterns of behavior. And so as the distillations of patterns of behavior, they have content. And it's not you, that content. You could even think about it as content that's evolved, although it's culturally transmitted. It's content that's evolved. And so these figures of the imagination can reveal the structure of reality to you. And that's what happened with Jung. And that's what he described in the Red Book. And that was what permeated his psychology, a psychology that was based on the presupposition that the fundamental archetypal structures of religious belief were not pathological, not deceitful, not protective in some delusional sense against the fear of death, but quite the contrary. The very stories that enabled us to move forward as confident human beings in the face of chaos itself. And it's conceivable, I think perhaps probable, that nothing more important conceptually happened in the 20th century than that. Because it was the first time post-Enlightenment that a rapprochement between the intellect and the underlying religious archetypal substructure occurred. You have in the capacious intellect of Jung, and the same thing happened to some degree with Piaget, the religious domain and the factual domain were brought back together. And the fact of Jung's enduring and increasing popularity and influence, I would say, is a direct consequence of that. Now, some of his work was spun off into the New Age, and the New Age is a very optimistic and naive movement. It's predicated on the idea that you can do nothing, say, but follow your bliss, and that will take you ever higher to enlightenment, and that's not the Jungian idea at all. The Jungian idea is that what you most need will be found where you least want to look. So there's this story, King Arthur. There's this story of King Arthur. They're all in a round table, right? King Arthur and his knights, they're all equals. They're all superordinate, but they're all equals. And they go off to look for the Holy Grail. And the Holy Grail is the container of the redemptive substance, whatever that is. It might be the cup that Christ used at the Last Supper, or it might be a chalice that was used to capture his blood on the cross, right, when he was pierced by a sword. The stories differ, but that's the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is lost. That's the redemptive substance, and the knights of King Arthur go off to search for the Holy Grail, but they don't know where to look. So where do you look when you don't know where to look for something you need desperately but have lost? Well, each of the knights goes into the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's Jungian psychoanalysis in a nutshell. It's like that which you fear and avoid, that which you hold in contempt, that which disgusts you and that you avoid. That's the gateway to what you need to know. There's nothing New Age about that. That's for sure. Now, Jung, when he started this endeavor, he started with this. This is part of the notebooks from the Black Book. He said, he wrote, my soul, where are you? Do you hear me? I speak. I call you. Are you there? I've returned. I'm here again. I've shaken the dust of all the lands from my feet, and I've come to you. I am with you. After long years of long wandering, I have come to you again. For the Jungians, the hero's journey is a journey within. And I think that that's probably the bias of introverts, to believe that the hero's journey is only an inward journey. I think that it can be an outward journey too, because I don't think it matters where you confront the unknown, whether it's within or without. What matters is whether or not you confront the unknown. That's what matters. But he found that what he had ignored was an undiscovered part of himself. So that might be something that was equivalent to Huxley's notion that there's tremendous potential breadth in the realm of human conscious experience. And Huxley was influenced to some degree by Jung. Now, Jung knew of Huxley's experiments and had commented on psychedelic use. And he said something like, beware of wisdom you did not earn. And Jung was very good at stating things very profoundly, very simply. And that's a very intelligent piece of advice. Beware of wisdom you did not earn. He wrote a paper, if you're interested in this sort of thing. He wrote a paper called The Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, which is an absolute masterwork, but completely incomprehensible unless you know what it's about. And what it's about is the danger of what he called ego inflation. And so one of the things that can happen as a consequence of a revelatory experience is that the division between the individual ego and what would you call it? It's so hard to come up with a word that isn't somehow naive or cliched. To erase the relationship, the boundary between the specific consciousness of the ego and the more generalized consciousness, and more generalized consciousness as such, is a dangerous thing to do, because you can start to equate yourself, your specific self, with that more generalized consciousness as such. And Jung thought about that as something akin to a psychotic inflation. And the paper, Relations Between the Ego and the Unconscious, is a document that tells you how to avoid that if you're playing in this kind of realm. And one of the injunctions is to keep your feet on the ground. He thought that was partly what happened to Nietzsche, was that Nietzsche wasn't grounded enough in life. He wasn't grounded enough in day-to-day rituals and routines and the mundane. Now, you can debate whether or not that's the case, and whether or not that's a reasonable argument, but that was still what Jung believed. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? I'll finish with this. From December 1913 onward, Jung carried on in the same procedure, deliberately evoking a fantasy in a waking state and then entering into it as a drama. These fantasies may be understood as a type of dramatized thinking in pictorial form. In retrospect, he recalled that his scientific question was to see what took place when he switched off consciousness. The example of dreams indicated the existence of background activity, and he wanted to give this a possibility of emerging, just as one does when taking mescaline. These journals are Jung's contemporaneous clinical ledger to his most difficult experiment, or what he later describes as a voyage of discovery to the other pole of the world. Jung believed that we were dreaming all the time, but that during waking life, the pressure of external images was such that the unconscious fantasy imagery was, or that the fantasy imagery was of insufficient magnitude to be conscious, but that we were always situated in a dream in relationship to the world. So, when we started talking about the creation of the universe at the beginning of the Genesis stories, I spent quite a long time setting the stage for the stories, because there's no point in having a conversation about the God who gives rise to being unless you have some sense of what that might conceivably mean to the modern mind. And I felt the same way about the Abrahamic stories, as I couldn't get a handle on them until I could understand and articulate more clearly what it might mean, how a modern person might understand a direct experience of God. And the first question would be, is such a thing possible? And the answer to that seems to be a qualified yes. First of all, it's a universal human experience. That's a very strange thing. It's not something that people have made up, as Freud might have it, as a defense against death. It's not a tenable hypothesis. It's a realm of potential experience. Now, that experience doesn't necessarily have to have the Judeo-Christian content that we've been discussing. Quite the contrary, there are manifestations of these alternative forms of consciousness all over the world that take on their own peculiar forms, although they're patterned to some degree. Like the hero myth, for example, the myth of the fight against the dragon seems to be unbelievably widespread. And so it's not as if it's random. But there's not much point in having a discussion about what happens to Abraham unless you can conceptualize it in terms that are amenable to modern skeptical consciousness. So we can establish the proposition that mystical experience is not only possible, it's quite common, and it's inducible in a variety of ways, and the manner in which it's inducible is reliable. And there's no evidence as well that it's pathological. In fact, there's a fair bit of evidence that the patterns of behavior that are associated with the mystical experience are core elements of proper human adaptation in the world. The Abrahamic stories open up with a manifest God. Now, I'm going to read you some things from Friedman, who wrote The Disappearance of God. He was trying to look at the underlying structure of the stories. Now, Friedman noted that the books in the Old Testament were written by a lot of different people at very different times. And then they were sequenced by other people for reasons that we don't exactly understand. But there's still an underlying narrative. There's multiple underlying narrative unities, despite the fact of that rather arbitrary sequencing. And that's a strange thing. I guess you could say, if you had a collection of ancient books and you were trying to put them together, you'd try to put them together in some way that made sense, right? And it wouldn't make sense unless you stumbled across some kind of underlying narrative that allowed you to order them. And so it's not entirely surprising that they're ordered in a manner that's comprehensible. But Friedman's comments on the underlying narrative structure, part of it was, well, we'll go through this. The books of the Old Testament were composed by a great many authors, according to both traditional religious views and modern critical scholarship. The phenomenon of the diminishing apparent presence of God across so many stories, through so many books, by so many authors, spread over so many centuries, is consistent enough to be striking, impressive, and ultimately mysterious. But the hiding of the divine face is only half the story. There's another development also extending across the course of the entire narrative of the Hebrew Bible, which we must see before we can appreciate the full force of this phenomena, and before we can pose a solution to the mystery of how this happened. Gradually, from Genesis to Ezra and Esther, there is a transition from divine to human responsibility for life on earth. The story begins in Genesis with God in complete control of the creation. But by the end, humans have arrived at a stage at which, in all apparent ways, they have responsibility for the fate of the world. The first two human beings, Adam and Eve, take little responsibility themselves. They do not design or build anything. When they're embarrassed over their nudity, they do not make clothes. They cover themselves with leaves. It's God who makes their first clothing for them. Noah, by no means a fully developed personality, Noah is not an everyman either. Broadly speaking, he reflects a step beyond Adam and Eve in human character and responsibility. Abraham, beyond the accounts of divine commands that Abraham does carry out, the narrative also includes a variety of stories in which Abraham acts on his own initiative. He divides land with his nephew Lot. He battles kings. He takes concubines. He argues with his wife Sarah. On 2 occasions, he tells kings that Sarah is his sister out of fear that they will kill him to get his wife. And he arranges his son's marriage. In the place of the single story of Noah's drunkenness, there are, in the case of Abraham, the stories of a man's life. The Abraham section thus develops the personality and character of man to a new degree in biblical narrative, while picturing in him a new degree of responsibility. It is not just that Abraham is kinder, gentler, more intrepid, more ethical, or a better debater than his ancestor Noah. Rather, both the Noah and the Abraham stories are pieces of a development of an increasingly stronger stance of humans relative to the deity. Before the story is over, humans will become a great deal stronger and bolder than Abraham. I don't know what that means, you know. See, it is certainly the case that the individual exists in the modern world. The differentiated, self-aware, self-conscious individual. And it's certainly the case that that wasn't the case at some point in the past. And so it's the case that there's been a development, I don't know if you could call it a progression, but a development of the autonomous individual over some span of historical time. Now, we don't know how long that's been, but my suspicions are it hasn't been that long. I mean, I read once about a Neolithic ceremony that involved the particular placement of a bear skull in a cave. And then I read that, and they had found these placements in caves that were at least 25,000 years old. And then I read that they found caves in Japan among the Ainu, who were the indigenous inhabitants of Japanese territory and rather archaic people, who had the same ceremony with the bear and that put the skull in the same orientation and place in caves, and that tradition remained unbroken for about 25,000 years. And you think, well, is it possible for an oral or ritual tradition to remain unbroken for spans of tens of thousands of years? And the answer to that is not only is it possible, it's actually the norm. Because like one chimpanzee is like the next chimpanzee, right? In the progression, in the biological progression. If you took a chimpanzee troop now and you went back 25,000 years and you looked at a chimpanzee troop, it'd be the same thing. There's no historical progression. That's how you can tell that chimps really don't have culture. Because if they could even accrete 1/1000% of culture, transmissible culture, per generation, it wouldn't take more than about 1 million years before they'd have a whole civilization. And they don't. They're the same as they were. And so the continuity, the stability, and unchanging nature of a species, essentially speaking, is the rule. That the variant is us. It's like, what the hell happened after the last ice age? 15,000 years ago. We went from tribal, uniform, stable to whatever the hell we are now. It's this transition from generic to specific. It's something like that. And I can't help but think that that's reflected in this text and that it has something to do with this transition of consciousness from what? From possession by the generic divine to dominance by the specific individual. It's something like that. Is that a neurological transformation? Is that what this is a record of? I mean, we don't know. One of the things Jung said about God, because Jung's relationship with God as an object of belief is very complex. In his technical writing, he always talks about the image of God. He never talks about God. He talks about the image of God. He said that the image of God dwells within. That's not the same thing as God dwelling within, right? So all of these capacities that we have for transcendent consciousness could be a byproduct of biological evolution. They can have no reflection. They can have no relationship whatsoever to an actual transcendent reality. There's no way of telling. The transcendent reality seems to manifest itself as an element of experience, but that doesn't mean that it has a reality outside of the subjective, even if it exists, as it clearly does. But Friedman suggests that what's happening in the biblical narrative is the sequential emergence of the individual as a redemptive force, and that the Old Testament documents that implicitly, unconsciously, as a consequence of descriptive fantasy, and that's what's going on in the book. And that, so the cosmos is under the control of generic deity to begin with, something like that. And then that control shifts to localized, identifiable, increasingly personal and detailed individuals. And you see that in Noah, and then you see it in Abraham, and then you see it in Moses. And then there's this working out of what it would mean to be a fully developed individual. And that's what these stories, they're like prototypes. They're attempts to bring about the proper mode of being, right? And so Abraham is a manifestation of that, because he enters into a covenant with God. He's selected by God, or enters into a partnership with God. It's not exactly obvious. God provides him with forward motion and intuition and leads him towards a successful mode of being. And it's complex, successful mode of being, because Abraham has a very complex life. There's plenty of ups and downs, right? It's not unbroken purity of being towards a divine end. Abraham lies and cheats and deceives and does all sorts of things that a real person would do. And Moses, for example, kills someone. And so these people, the biblical people, are very genuine individuals, but they're given, with all their faults, right, with all their sins, with all their deceit, they're still put forth as potential modes of proper, models of potential proper being in the world. And the entire corpus of the Bible seems to be nothing but an attempt to keep throwing up variants of the personality, trying to experiment to find out what personality works in the world. And of course, from a Christian perspective, that culminates in the figure of Christ as the redemptive word, and that's associated, as we've already talked about, with the force that brought order out of chaos at the beginning of time. And so, well, that's my attempt to provide proper context for the understanding of the Abrahamic stories. And so, hopefully, with that context, we can move forward, being able to swallow the camel, so to speak, of the initial presence of God in the stories. And so we'll return to all of that next week. Let's wait 1 second, okay, until people have an opportunity to leave. I would very much like to ask the people who are asking the questions to take a few seconds before they ask the question and make sure that the mic is positioned properly so that everyone can hear you, because people keep writing and complaining that, well, they're very happy with the questions, and I would say the questions have been of very high caliber so far, but they're not very happy that they can't hear them. So I know that, you know, you're obviously nervous and in a hurry when you want to ask a question, but take a second or two to set the mic up properly and make sure that everyone can hear you. And so, have a way at it.
Hello, Dr. Peterson.
Hey, there we go.
Tonight, I'd like to ask you about two different psychological disorders. The first being borderline personality disorder. So 2 lectures ago, somebody asked you about it, and you gave a very sparse answer. I can't remember exactly what you said, but it seemed like it was there was too much complexity to just answer it right there and then. And then somebody else also asked you about the same disorder in your Patreon live stream recently. And when they asked you that, you kind of you kind of stopped for a moment and something, I don't know, something kind of flicked on in your head, and it seemed like, and you thought for a couple seconds, and then you said, you know what, I don't think that I can answer that right now because it's just too bloody complex. And I was wondering, just like many young men have gravitated towards your lectures, do you think that there's something about this particular disorder that there's something about people with this particular disorder that might gravitate to your insights and your lectures?
Okay, so I would say probably no to the second one, but I could comment more about borderline personality disorder. I think I have enough mental energy to do that tonight. So, technically speaking, it's often considered the female variant of antisocial personality disorder. So it's classified in the domain of externalizing disorders, acting out disorders. And I think what happens, we don't understand borderline personality disorder very well. I mean, it's characterized by tremendous impulsivity, radical confusion of identity, and then this pattern of idealization of people with whom the person afflicted with the disorder is associating, with radical idealization of those people and then radical devaluation of them. And then there's another theme that sort of weaves along with it, which is the proclivity of people with borderline personality disorder to presume that they will be abandoned and then to act in a manner that makes such abandonment virtually certain. And so it's a very complicated disorder, but that, I think, gets at the crux of it. One of the things that's interesting about people with borderline personality disorder, in my experience, is that they're often quite intelligent. And you see in the person with borderline personality disorder something like the waste or the squandering of tremendous potential. They seem capable of thinking through the nature of their problems and analyzing them and discussing it, but not capable whatsoever of implementing any solutions. And technically, there's no relationship between IQ and conscientiousness. It's very weird. Because if you read the neuropsychological literature, and you read about the functions of the prefrontal cortex, they're usually conceptualized in intellectual terms. And they're associated with planning and strategizing and so forth. And that's what conscientiousness is planning and strategizing and implementation. But the correlation between IQ and conscientiousness is zero. And so is the correlation between working memory and conscientiousness. Zero. And zero is a very low correlation, right? I mean, really, it's hard to find things in psychology that are correlated at zero. Things tend to be correlated to some degree. They tend to be interrelated. The borderline seems to be able to strategize and to abstract, but not to be able to implement. And so the intellect per se seems to be functional, but it's not embodied in action. So it can be frustrating to be associated with someone who has borderline personality disorder because they can tell you what the problem is and even tell you what the solution might be, but there's no implementation. So maybe something went wrong developmentally. We don't know exactly how these sorts of things come about. The other thing that seems to be characteristic of people with borderline personality disorder is that they remind me very much of people who are 2 years old. And in some manner, like people with borderline personality disorder can have temper tantrums. In fact, they often do. And now and then you see a temper tantrum and they're usually thrown by 2-year-olds, right? Most people grow out of temper tantrums by the time they're about 3. They're very rare at 4, which is a good thing, because if they're still there at 4, that is not a good diagnostic predictor. That's actually a good diagnostic predictor, but it's not the kind that you want. And, it's funny the way that we respond to 2-year-old temper tantrums, because the 2-year-old will throw themselves on the ground and beat their hands and their legs on the floor and scream and yell and turn red or even blue. I saw a child once who was capable of holding his breath during a temper tantrum till he turned blue, which was really an impressive feat. You should try that, right? It's really hard. You really have to work at it. And you see that in adult borderlines. They'll have temper tantrums. And the funny thing is, when a 2-year-old does it, it's like it's a little off-putting. But when an adult does it, it's completely bloody terrifying. And it happens very frequently with borderlines. And so I would also say, to some degree, they didn't get properly socialized between that critical period of development between 2 and 4. And you see the same thing with adult males who grow up to be antisocial. Because a large proportion of adult males who grow up to be antisocial are aggressive as children, as 2-year-olds. And so there's a small proportion of 2-year-olds who are quite aggressive. They'll kick and hit and bite and steal if you put them with other 2-year-olds. It's about 5% of the males, smaller fraction of the females. But most of them are socialized by the time they're 4. But there's a small percentage who aren't, and they tend to stay antisocial, and they tend to turn into long-term offenders. And the critical period for socialization development seems to be between 2 and 4. And it seems to be mediated by pretend play and rough and tumble play and those sorts of mechanisms. And if it isn't instantiated by the age of 4, it doesn't happen. And it doesn't look like it's addressable. Now, there are dialectic behavioral therapies that have been developed for people with borderline personality disorder, and they're purported to be successful. But
okay, thank you. If I may, so the second psychological disorder I wanted to ask you about is psychopathy. So you've mentioned that psychopaths tend to switch from dominance hierarchy to dominance hierarchy because people get tired of their shenanigans and they have to move on to fresh people. And psychopaths also tend to be very low in conscientiousness. And you said that when you see some of these protesters at your speeches, some of the men in particular, your clinical intuition tells you that there's something seriously pathological about them. And I was wondering if you would suspect that some of these men might be psychopathic as...
Well, some of them likely are, but I don't know if a higher proportion of the ones who show up at protests and sort of creep me out are... I don't know if there's a higher proportion of people like that at the protests or not. I mean, I suspect in general that regardless of the protest, the proportion of people who have personality disorders among protesters is higher than the proportion of people who have personality disorders in the general population. Because you just expect that. You just expect that kind of acting out behavior. Believe me, I'm not saying that all protest is associated with personality disorder. I'm not saying that at all. There's plenty of reason for protest, but some of the reason for protests are credible reasons and some of them aren't credible reasons.
And I was just thinking that like the social justice hierarchy, so to speak, would be one of the last that these confused men...
That's a different issue. You know, there are analysis of the dangers of agreeableness. So agreeableness is a personality trait that underlies the radical egalitarian ethos, because agreeable people want everything to be shared equally. And I think it's a good ethos for a small group, for a family, because a family is kind of a communist system in some sense, right? It's like you want the food to be divided up equally among the children, clearly, and you want all the children, sort of regardless of their inherent abilities, to have the same opportunities and perhaps even the same outcomes. So I think agreeableness, which is associated at least in part with the maternal instinct, let's say, maternal patterns of behavior, I think it's a good first pass motivational approximation to a localized familial ethic. I think it's a catastrophe at larger scales. I don't think it scales at all. I actually think that's why we evolved conscientiousness. Because conscientiousness is the principle that allows larger scale organizations to exist. Agreeableness won't do it. Now, conscientiousness is a mystery, right? We don't have a neurological model. We don't have a conceptual model. We don't have an animal model. We don't have a pharmacological model. And we really only have one way of assessing it, which is self and other reports of personality proclivity. So, anyways, the problem with agreeableness, this has been modeled by game theorists, is that a population of cooperative people can be dominated by a single shark. So agreeableness is insufficient as a principle because it opens itself up to, what do you call that? Manipulation and...
Infiltration. I thought that was Arnold's suggestion.
Manipulation, let's leave it at that, to manipulation and exploitation. That's the other thing, exploitation. So,
Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Peterson. I had one quick comment and a question. So my comment was about your idea of sub-personalities as one-eyed monsters. Now, there's the idea of multiple personality or split personality disorder. It's controversial as to whether or not it exists. But there's some recent research that suggests that you may actually have multiple personalities that use different parts of the brain. So they have differential access to the hippocampus, they have their own memories, and they can... They use the brain differently. But that seems to be an exaggeration of subpersonalities to me, which is quite interesting. The question I had was about, so you talked about Jung and how you should confront that which you don't want to confront the most, or you're most afraid of or disgusted by, that you have the most resistance to. But we were talking about psychedelics and the experience of hell. So at least some of the people I've talked to, they describe negative trips as an experience of constant fear, prolonged fear, and some of the most dramatic and personalized fear that they've ever experienced. So shouldn't negative psychedelic trips elicit the kind of confrontation that Jung thought you should engage in?
could be. Could well be. You know, it's conceivable that I read this strange book once that made the claim that what was in the Ark of the Covenant was a mixture that was made from Amanita muscaria mushrooms. And that's not as far-fetched as you might think, because there was a mycologist, an amateur mycologist named Gordon Wasson, who established credibly the notion that it was Amanita muscaria potions that was the soma of the Rig Veda. And so it's a strange idea, but it's not an idea that's completely outside of the realm of possibility. And the Amanitas muscaria, it's the fly agaric, a red mushroom with white dots, and it's used in shamanic rituals across Asia. And it's apparently not toxic in its dried form, although that is not a recommendation. You know, this is serious and dangerous speculation and material. One of the things that the priests had to do before they communed with what was ever in the Ark of the Covenant was purify themselves. And so one possibility is that the bad psychedelic experience is a involuntary confrontation with what Jung would describe as the shadow. It's like, so beware of experimenting with substances that produce divine revelations if you're in a serious state of disorder. And I do think that is what happens to people, is that they encounter everything about them that's chaotic and out of place. And some people get trapped in that and they can't get beyond it. And that's because there's so much of it. And so, but we don't know enough to know. So, yeah.
Citizen Peterson, you son of a bitch. How are you?
I'm not too bad. You got a question?
That's my question. No, I've got a real question. I got a
Okay.
good question. You're going to like this one.
Okay.
It's about inspiration, because you talk about inspiration quite a bit in this lecture series, and also I wanted to point out you have I guess a 45-minute armchair discussion, which you have a video of one paragraph of Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, which
Yes.
you posted. And it seems like you're awestruck at the structure and the choices and I guess the ideas contained in various layers of this paragraph. And you're inspired, and that inspires you to, I guess, do your work that you do. I encountered, I guess, a similar phenomenon here with one sentence written by the great Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. And I mean, this one sentence answers the question, why do people search for God? And if you could read it out and then deconstruct it, it's one sentence. It's at the end of page 105 if you want to read it from the book, or I just...
That's the question that human existence not only poses, but itself is, the inconclusiveness inherent in it, the bounds it comes up against, and that yet yearn for the unbounded, more or less in the sense of Nietzsche's assertion that all pleasure yearns for eternity, yet experiences itself as a moment. This simultaneity of being limited and of yearning for the unbounded and open has always prevented man from resting in himself, made him sense that he is not self-sufficient, but only comes to himself by going outside himself and moving toward the entirely other and infinitely greater. Well, it's a hell of a sentence.
Like when I read that sentence, I decided I wanted to write like Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger. I had a very similar experience when I watched the Joe Rogan podcast 877. I said, I want to speak like Jordan Peterson. That's what I wanted to do.
So I had this discussion with a Patreon supporter this week, a young guy from Australia. And he said something very interesting that's related to this. And it's something that's very profound, I think. There's this idea in Christianity that we've discussed briefly that the judge and the redeemer are the same figure. Now, you know, in the book of Revelation, you may know this or you may not, Christ comes back as a judge, and he has a sword coming. It's a revelatory vision, that book. It's a very strange... It's the last thing you'd expect conservative Christians to believe in. Believe me, it's such a visionary hallucination, the book of Revelation. But Christ comes back with a sword coming out of his mouth, and he comes back as a judge. And he divides the damned from the redeemed, and most are damned and some are redeemed. It's very, very harsh. Now, Jung believed that the figure of Christ in the Gospels was too agreeable, too merciful, too tilted towards mercy, and that called out for a counter position, and that was the counter position of judgment. Very interesting hypothesis. But then there's this melding of the two ideas that the judge and the redeemer are the same thing. Okay. Now, this young man told me that his life lacked purpose and direction and meaning, and that he was nihilistic until he read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which is a book I actually like quite a bit. I've read it 3 times at different decades of my life. And one of the things that's very interesting about that book is that it's an examination of the idea of quality, of the idea that there are qualitative distinctions between things, and that we have an instinct to make qualitative distinctions. And so a qualitative distinction is simply, this is better than that, which is a judgment. Okay, now what Ratzinger is hypothesizing is that the person in and of, you know how the modern idea is you're supposed to accept yourself. I think that's an insane idea, by the way. Really, I can't think of a more nihilistic idea than that you're already okay. It's like, no, you're not. And the reason you're not is because you could be way more than you are. And so what do you want to be? You want to be okay as you are? Or do you want to strive towards what's better? And this young man, this Australian, he said that the reason that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance had such an impact on him was because he wasn't happy with his current mode of being, right? He didn't consider the manner in which he conducted himself sufficient. And the fact that the author of Zen, and it was Persig, laid out the notion that you could make qualitative distinctions, and there really was a difference between good things and bad things, or great things and evil things. It gives you direction. It gives you the possibility of moving upward. And Ratzinger is pointing out, at least to some degree, that human beings are insufficient in and of themselves and need the movement upward. And so they need to conceptualize something like the highest good, and then to strive for that. And the thing is that there isn't any difference between conceptualizing the good and being judged. Because if you're going to conceptualize the good and move towards it, what you have to do is separate from yourself all those things that aren't good and leave them behind. And that's why the Redeemer and the Judge are the same thing. And one of the things that's really appalling, I think, about our modern world is that we're rejecting the notion of qualitative distinctions. You say, well, we don't want to hurt anybody's feelings by saying that one thing is better than another. It's like, okay, fair enough. It's not fun to be cast off with the damned, that's for sure. But if people are in fact insufficient in their present condition, which seems to be the case, I mean, try finding someone who isn't, then if you deny the possibility of qualitative distinction because you want to promote a radical egalitarianism, then you remove the possibility of redemption because there's no movement towards the good. And it seems to me that it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for, well, it's a catastrophe to sacrifice the good for the equal. Because for us to be equal would mean, as far as I can tell, that we would all be equally unredeemed and miserable. And so...
He also mentions in the previous paragraph, I believe, that even in the case when you experience the human life at its fullest, at its most beautiful, at its most meaningful, you have a deep, I guess, understanding that you have something to be thankful for. You need to thank somebody for that. It's not based entirely on your own merit. And that points you towards something else. And also
I don't think that you can have a profoundly positive experience, you know, in the best sense, without that accompanying it. That's a feeling of being blessed. It's something like that. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's good.
That book back, and also I'd like to talk.
Wait, hold it. I'm going to stop you. Okay, because I'm going to ask this person. But I would like to say that those were remarkably good questions. So...
Dr. Peterson, thank you for the wonderful lecture. Given your working definition of truth, and let's say within the Abrahamic religious tradition, would you say that the more perhaps mystical sects and denominations, which place more emphasis on the transcendental experience of God, of the awe-induced experience, as opposed to the more fundamentalist, orthodox, literalist, which perhaps emphasize what I've noticed, moral policing of behaviors.
Yep.
Would you say that the former is more true than the latter?
No.
And
no. Okay, sorry, continue.
And B, could the former in some way serve as an antidote to extremist literalism, jihadism, fundamentalism?
Okay, so yes to the second part. But the first part, it's a great question. We did some research on this a while back because we were looking at the different religious proclivities of liberals and conservatives. And liberals, like if you're liberal, it means you're high in openness and low in conscientiousness. And if you're conservative, then you're high in conscientiousness and low in openness. And the liberals are spiritual and the conservatives are dogmatic. But it's best to think of those as partners, right? Because the spiritual mystical end is where the revelations emerge and the renewal, but that's where there's chaos and discord as well. Because what's new disrupts what's stable. And so what's new has to be turned into, it has to be integrated into what's stable. And so you need both those poles. And of course, if the dogmatists get the upper hand, then everything turns into a tyranny of stone. That's Egypt in the Old Testament. But if the mystics get the upper hand, then everything floats off the earth into some impractical ether that is equally counterproductive. And so there has to be a dialogue between those different poles. And I think you see that in the distribution of human temperament. You know, the conscientious types, they tend to be orderly. The orderly types tend towards the kind of a right-wing totalitarianism. That's their proclivity when things get out of hand, especially if they're low in openness. That's a danger. But you see the same thing with the people who are too open and not conscientious at all. They're dreaming all the time, but they never do anything. There's never anything implemented, and that's a bad thing. So I don't think that you can say that like the dogmatic structure is necessary because that perpetuates the system, and the revelatory element is necessary because that renews it when renewal is necessary. And there has to be a continual dialogue between those elements so that neither of them fall prey to their own particular form of pathology. And that's one of the problems with the current political, what would you call it, polarization that's occurring across the West, is that the right and the left are not talking to each other anymore. That's a very bad thing because the left will wander into a pit and fail without boundaries, and the right will enclose itself in smaller and smaller spaces until it can't move without the left. And one of the reasons that democracy works is because it makes people talk, or allows them to talk. You can have it either way. But it's because every virtue has its vice, right? And a meta virtue is something like the amalgamation of singular virtues into something that's a transcendent structure that has more to do with the harmony of virtues rather than with any given virtue. Even though I think that freedom of speech is the clearest manifestation of that harmony of virtues. So
awe could be a lubricant for the beginning of this discussion, do you think, between liberals and conservatives?
I don't know how to answer that. It doesn't follow immediately from your initial presupposition, so the awe experience is a different issue. Yeah, well, yes.
At least exposing conservatives to some form of experience. Could it be a prerequisite for a more productive dialogue?
See, I mean, in the church, in a church ceremony, let's say, a classical church ceremony, there's some intermingling of both, right? I mean, you think about a church ceremony that takes place in a Gothic cathedral. Well, you certainly got the dogma and the relatively rigid rule structure, but at the same time, that's aligned with intense beauty in the architectural forms, in the light that's streaming in through the stained glass windows, and the music. And I mean, the Gothic cathedral is a forest, right? It's a stone forest with sunlight streaming in through the trees. And it's a balance between structure and light. They're absolutely unbelievable structures. And they speak of the transcendent, but inside that there's a structure. And so it seems that in order for the religious impulse to be balanced properly, there has to be a reasonable dialogue, even in practice, between the mystical, awe-inspiring, transcendent, and the dogmatic. Yeah, either of those can go either of those goes astray without the other. If you're too dogmatic, do you need awe? Likely. Yes, because that would show you that there's something beyond your own presuppositions. So awe, I should tell you something interesting about awe as a physiological phenomena. You know how you're listening to music and you get chills? Some people experience that more than others. Open people experience that more. Or music is a pretty reliable elicitor of chills. That's piloerection. That's your hair standing on end. You see a cat when it sees a dog, puffs up. That's awe. It's the same thing. Like that chill is your hair standing on end. And that's the sensation you get in the presence of a meta-predator. It's something like that. And so the awe experience is obviously it's become very cognitively and emotionally complex in human beings, but its fundamental evolutionary underpinning is the instantaneous piloerection that you see in prey animals when they're confronted by a predator. And of course that would be, if you were a rabbit, you can bloody well believe that you see a wolf and it would inspire awe. That's for sure. I mean, if a wolf that was 20 feet high came bounding in here, man, you'd feel awe. So, yeah. That'll convince you that there's something that you still need to know. Last question.
Perfect timing. Hi, Dr. Peterson. My name is Gary, and I'm a clinical and counseling master's student right now. And so one of the key ideas that's been surfacing time and time again in your lectures is the idea that phenomenology is structured and flows mythologically. And the way that plays out is, I'm supposing affectively, you just pay attention to what comes up kind of naturally, and you can locate the chaotic elements in your experience and prod at them with whatever degree of necessity you think. So trying to situate this within the clinical context, we can conceptualize psychotherapy as a kind of guided journey, just as you touched on in this lecture, where it's more of a meta journey in a sense, a meta-heroic journey. I don't know how you want to think about it. But just for those of us who are interested in kind of grounding and implementing these ideas within psychotherapeutic practice, what should we watch out for in the process itself? What comes up? What should we be afraid of or fearful of or cautious about, or what should we tend towards? That's my question.
Well, I think one of the people who I've read that's had the biggest impact on me as a clinician was Carl Rogers. And the reason for that is that Carl Rogers put tremendous emphasis on listening. Like, it's almost impossible to overestimate how useful it is to listen to your clients. Like, you need a meta scheme in some sense. And the meta scheme, I think, is laid out in the Sermon on the Mount. It's something like, orient yourself and your client towards the good. The client has to conceptualize what that might be. You can serve as a guide, but it has to come from that person. Because one of the things that you want to find out from your client is, okay, what's wrong? They have to tell you. And what would not having something wrong look like? Like, what is it, if you could have what you wanted, and that would be good, what would that look like? Okay, so that establishes your star, right? It's like Geppetto establishing the relationship with the star at the beginning of Pinocchio. Here's what we're aiming at. Okay, so now you've got that schema. Here's what we're aiming at. Now you might think, well, now that what happens to the client is they meet their dragons along the way. And their dragons would be, well, now you know what you want, and there are things in your way. And some of those things many of those things are going to be intensely practical. But they're practical / psychological. So maybe someone has a job and they would like to move forward in their job, but they're terrified of speaking in public. Well, is that a psychological problem or a practical problem? It's both. It's also a real problem. In many positions, unless you can speak fluently, publicly, you're going to hit a ceiling and you're not going to go anywhere. And so for the person to move towards that goal, then they have to confront the obstacles that manifest themselves within that framework. And part of your job as a clinician is to identify the obstacles and to discriminate them from things they don't have to worry about, right? Part of it is, you can't just run around and try to combat all the chaos in the world. Some of it is your chaos and a bunch of it isn't. And the chaos that's yours is the chaos that emerges as you move towards a necessary goal. And so partly what you're doing by listening to your client is to help them cut their dragons down to size. Because what'll happen if you start to talk to somebody about public speaking and you really talk to them is that you decompose the problem into a set of maybe 20 sub-problems. Like, well, do you know exactly how to give a speech? Like, what's your theory of public speaking? Do you know how to look at people when you're talking? Do you know how to speak loudly enough so that people can hear you? Do you have a philosophy of public speaking? All those things are necessary in order to do it properly. You need to decompose that with the client, and then to make those problems, you have to decompose them to the point where they can be met by a practical solution. And then you have to guide the person through the implementation of the practical solution. And mostly you do that by listening. It's like what you need to be is the person who helps the person that you're working with orient themselves towards a better future. That's the compact. You and I are in this space at this time to make things better. First of all, we have to decide what better would look like. And second, we need a strategy. And third, we need to, once we have that, we're going to see the obstacles. And some of those are going to be psychological and some of them are going to be practical. And we're going to engage in joint problem solving of whatever sort is necessary in order to minimize the impact of those problems or to gain from the problems. And dream analysis can be extremely useful for that, by the way. It's even more useful for helping the person identify what the goal is, because that's often difficult for people. It's like, well, I know that something's wrong, but I don't know what I want. Sometimes people get so stuck there that they just can't get out of it. So, and then what would you watch out for?
Phenomenologically, the way it shows up, the way it's experienced.
Well, I would say as a clinician, one of the things that you should watch out for is resentment. So there's a couple of rules of thumb that I think are useful. Don't do anything for your clients that they can do for themselves. And don't do them any favors. Now, I think you can step beyond the confines of your role carefully, now and then, to show that there's a more human connection than the merely contractual. I think that's very useful. But their problems are not your problems. You do not have any right to their problems. And so you have to maintain that detachment, because otherwise you can steal their destiny. You don't want to be the person that solves their problems, because you steal their destiny when you do that. You want to be someone with whom they can figure things out for themselves. And so there can be hubris in being a clinician because you can be the problem solver, and that elevates you to a position. You elevate yourself to that position, you'll fall flat on your face. You'll hurt your clients, and things will kick back on you very, very hard. Because what the hell do you know, right? Nothing. Because that person is very complicated, and they need to sort themselves out. But you can be a facilitator for that. But that's all you should be. And so you have to watch that. You have to watch becoming overly entangled. So you have to maintain your detachment in the best sense. And you have to not overstep your... It's easy to become hubristic when the person is looking to you for the answers. It's like you don't have the answers, although you might be able to help the person find their way. That's what you do with everyone you love too, right? I mean, you don't provide them with the answers because then they become little clones of you. And unhappy, bitter, resentful, and angry little clones of you because you've usurped their destiny. And so the same thing applies within familial arrangements or friendships, all of that. So.
If you found this conversation meaningful, you might think about picking up Dad's books, Maps of Meaning, The Architecture of Belief, or his newer bestseller, 12 Rules for Life, An Antidote to Chaos. Both of these works delve much deeper into the topics covered in the Jordan B. Peterson podcast. See jordanbpeterson.com for audio, ebook, and text links, or pick up the books at your favorite bookseller. Remember to check out jordanbpeterson.com/personality for information on his new course, which is now 50% off. I really hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, please let a friend know or leave a review. Next week's episode is a continuation of the biblical series and is titled The Call to Abraham. Talk to you next week.
Follow me on my YouTube channel, Jordan B. Peterson, on Twitter @Jordan B. Peterson, on Facebook @Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, and at Instagram @Jordan.B.Peterson. Details on this show, access to my blog, information about my tour dates and other events, and my list of recommended books can be found on my website, jordanbpeterson.com. My online writing programs, designed to help people straighten out their pasts, understand